Hi guys, welcome to another video. This week is Feeding Tube Awareness Week. So I'm going to be telling you guys a little bit about my feeding tube and why I have my tube and what kind of tube I have. And I'm going to be answering some questions about my feeding tube. And I'm also just going to be explaining a little bit about tubes in general. So here we go. So first off, why do I have my feeding tube? So I have my tube for two reasons. One, I have severe gastroparesis. I was diagnosed with gastroparesis a little over 1.5 years ago, and ever since I was diagnosed, my stomach has progressively been getting worse. So last July, it was decided that I needed a feeding tube. I had lost over 25 pounds. I was incredibly malnourished. I was underweight. I was just incredibly ill. And also, the other factor that played into me needing a feeding tube was my severe hypoglycemia. So I have a growth disorder called severe primary IGF-1 deficiency, and that has always caused me to have low blood sugar for my entire life. But after I was unable to eat enough, my blood sugar really just took over, and I was living basically with a blood sugar of 40 every day, and my labs were starting to show that that was actually starting to do some damage to my body. And after we'd gotten my most recent labs back showing the extent of how severe my hypoglycemia was, I was hospitalized 2 days later and I had my first feeding tube placed. So what kind of tube do I have? So when I first had my tube placed, I had what was called an NJ tube, or a nasojejunal tube. So it went through my nose, down my throat, into my stomach, and it actually continued on past my stomach and went into a piece of my small intestine called the jejunum. If I were to be fed into my stomach, I would still be sick. So I'm fed into my intestines, and that way I'm able to tolerate my feeds and get the proper nutrition without causing a ton of pain and nausea. So I had my NJ tube for 8 to 9 weeks, and then my doctors decided that I was gonna have a GJ tube placed. I was thriving on my feeding tube. I was gaining weight, I had energy, I was no longer malnourished, my blood sugar was more stable, and it was decided that this is going to be a long-term thing. So a GJ tube is a surgical tube, so I had to have surgery to have that placed. Unlike my NJ tube, which is placed in fluoroscopy or interventional radiology. And I've had my tube for around 5 months, and I'm on my third surgical tube. The first one that I got, I had for 2 months, which was the standard PEG-J tube, which was really big. And then I got to switch to my button, and then my button got buried in my abdominal wall. And now I have another dangler tube, or PEG-J tube, but this one seems to be working out very well for me, and overall I am thriving on my feeding tube. It has truly saved my life and greatly improved my quality of life. So now here are just a few questions that I frequently get asked. Can you swim with a feeding tube? Yes, so feeding tubes are water safe. I'm able to take a bath, take a shower, go swimming in a pool, and I don't really have to do anything for it. However, my doctors have advised me that if I were to go in a lake or a river or the ocean or something like that, I should cover it with like a dressing or a piece of Tegaderm, just to avoid potentially getting bacteria in my tube from dirty water. But I still could swim. But if I'm going in just like a pool or something, I don't need to cover it. But it is water safe. Does it hurt? Well, initially the surgery is very painful, but aside from the initial placement, as long as the tube is in the right place and it's working, it's not really painful. I mean, it can be uncomfortable at times due to granulation tissue or other irritations of the stoma, but it's not really painful a lot of the time. I will say though, the only time that it is bothersome is if I try to lay on my stomach. Then you really feel the tube and it is kind of painful, so I do have to avoid laying on my stomach. So this question I thought was funny, it made me smile. What does it feel like to sneeze or blow your nose with an NJ tube in, or any sort of nasal tube? So sneezing always felt very weird, and I ended up, when I first got my tube, I would sneeze a lot because my nose was like irritated, and it was like, hey, there's something in your nose, we need to sneeze. But it's not painful or anything, it's just kind of a weird uncomfortable feeling because the tube kind of moves a little bit, not like drastically moves, but it does kind of move a little bit in your sinuses, and so it just kind of feels weird. You just kind of feel the little noodle in your nose, but you can still blow your nose and you can still sneeze with the tube, but it does feel a little bit weird. What formula do I use? So this is the formula that I use. It's Kate Farms Core Essentials, and I use the standard formula, which is just a 1-cal formula, and this one happens to be vanilla flavored. Mine goes through my tube, but you can drink it. But this is the formula that I'm on. So originally when I had a feeding tube, I was on something called Liquid Hope, and I started on the pediatric version of that, and then I went to just the standard Liquid Hope, and both of those were just not the right formula for me. They clogged my tube like more than 3 times an hour. I hardly slept for like 2 weeks when I first got my tube, and I was just miserable. It was causing a whole bunch of intestinal upset, and I really just didn't tolerate that formula very well. But it was really important to us that I have a formula that is made of real food. I have allergies to processed sugars and also to dairy, so that ruled out a lot of formulas because most are made with like sugar, milk, high fructose corn syrup, and a lot of other stuff that I would have a mast cell reaction to. So we really needed one that was allergen friendly, and it really just was important to us that I fuel my body with healthy nutrition and real food. And so we tried Liquid Hope first and Nourish, their pediatric form, and it really didn't work. But after 2 weeks, we started on Kate Farms, and ever since then, I swear, it was like night and day. I tolerated the formula just fine. I no longer had intestinal pain and upset and bloating and stuff like that. And also, I have not had a serious tube clog since I started the formula. The other formula was really like thick and gritty, and Kate Farms is really smooth, and it's pretty much the same consistency as a regular formula, which I find convenient. And speaking of Kate Farms, for Feeding Tube Awareness Week, they are asking people to share their stories. So if you go to Kate Farms' Instagram page, which I will link in the description, there's a link in their bio where you can submit your story, and if you enter before February 28th, you will get a free prize. So make sure to go do that. But overall, my general experience with Kate Farms has been so amazing, and I am just so grateful that I'm able to... My infusion's done. And I am just so grateful to be on such a good formula. So those are some of the questions that I get asked a lot, and if you have more questions, leave them in the comments and I will happily answer any questions you have about my tube. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about feeding tubes in general. So there are lots of different types of tubes. There are nasal tubes and there are surgical tubes. For nasal tubes, there are NG tubes, NJ tubes, ND tubes. There are several different kinds. So NG tubes, or nasogastric tubes, are tubes that go through your nose and end in your stomach. So I'm going to put a diagram right here. So if you have an NG tube, you're fed into your stomach. NG tubes can also be used to drain stomach contents for someone who can't digest whatever's in their stomach or needs to vent their stomach to prevent them from getting sick or to help relieve nausea or bloating and stuff like that. So there are several reasons why someone might have an NG tube. And then there are NJ tubes. So NJ stands for nasojejunal tube, and that's the type of tube that I had, as I mentioned before, and that goes through your nose, down your stomach, and past your stomach to a piece of your small intestine called your jejunum. And I'll put a diagram right here. And that's used for people who can't really tolerate feeds into their stomach, and so they just bypass the stomach in order to get the nutrition that they need without causing pain and bloating and nausea. There are also nasal duodenal tubes, or ND tubes, and these aren't quite as common because typically if you're going to bypass the stomach, they do an NJ tube, but they do occasionally place ND tubes. So an ND tube goes through your nose, down your stomach. It bypasses your stomach, but it just goes into the very beginning piece of your small intestine called the duodenum. Again, this is typically used for people who can't tolerate feeds into their stomach, but again, they're not too common, but they do get placed, so I figured I'd mention them. And then there are surgical tubes. So there are G tubes, J tubes, GJ tubes, And there's different varieties of every tube. There's GJ buttons, there's PEG-J tubes, and I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of detail of the different like specific types of tubes. I'm just going to cover like G, J, and GJ. So first I'm going to talk about G tubes, or gastric feeding tubes. So with any type of surgical tube, they create a hole in your abdomen called a stoma, and that is what the feeding tube actually goes through. A G tube goes directly into the stomach, and that is where you are fed, or you can drain or put medicine through. And then there are plain J tubes, which I'll put a diagram of that right here as well. With J tubes, the stoma is made directly into the small intestine in the jejunum. For people who can't tolerate feed into their stomach, they would get either a J tube or a GJ tube so that they could be fed into their intestines. So with GJ tubes, the stoma itself is actually in the stomach, but a piece of that tube actually continues on into the jejunum where you can be fed. So that's the type of tube that I have, and for me it's very convenient because it's one stoma and one tube, but I have access to both my stomach and my jejunum. There are so many different conditions that require feeding tubes, not just gastroparesis. Anyone, girl or boy of any age, can need a feeding tube, and some people won't need a feeding tube for a while and they would have been able to eat, and then now they do need a feeding tube. Others have been feeding tube fed their entire life, and some people can eat in addition to a feeding tube. I personally can eat a few hundred calories every day by mouth, but I get the majority of my nutrition through a feeding tube. And some people aren't able to eat anything, and they are completely fed through their feeding tube. But if you see someone with a feeding tube and they are eating, don't call them out on it, and don't be like, oh, you can eat, you don't need a feeding tube, because you don't know their situation, and who knows, they might get sick anyways and they're just choosing to eat. But just because you have a feeding tube doesn't mean that you can't eat. It just means that you're not able to eat enough and you need some extra nutritional support. Another thing that I want to address that some people tend to forget is that you don't necessarily need to be underweight to need a feeding tube. Just because someone is a healthy weight does not mean that they are well nourished. They could be totally malnourished and still be overweight and require a feeding tube. And I know for many people who have a feeding tube, they are a healthy weight because of their feeding tube. So not everyone with a feeding tube is super skinny and underweight. Oftentimes, people who have been on a feeding tube are a healthy weight, which is a good thing, and anyone, regardless of their size, can need a feeding tube. You are still beautiful whether you have a tube or not. So I personally have struggled a little bit with body image and just not really wanting to share my tube and just being a little self-conscious about it because I felt different, and it's a medical device hanging off of you. And when I first got my feeding tube, I was really self-conscious and I didn't necessarily feel very pretty. I felt like my feeding tube was ugly. I've come to learn that that is not the case at all. Feeding tubes in no way make you any less beautiful. In fact, it just makes you more unique. I always tell people never to be ashamed of your tube because it is saving your life, and that is always something to be appreciated. So I asked you guys on Instagram to send me pictures of your feeding tubes so that I could include them in this video. All of these people have feeding tubes for a ton of different reasons. They have different types of feeding tubes, and while we are all fighting different battles, we are all in this together. me pictures. I'm so glad I was able to include a bunch of different tubies in this video. And remember, I linked Kate Farm's Instagram in the description, so go share your story to win a free prize. I've also included all of my feeding tube videos. I actually have vlogs of me getting my NJ tube and my different GJ tubes placed, and I have a whole bunch of videos about my feeding tubes, so I've linked those in the description as well. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Give it a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye!